Let's, I guess, dive in. I'll give you just a brief introduction about myself. First of all, today's talk is called The Anatomy of a DDoS. My name is Janna Hilferty, and I'm a DevOps engineer. I've been doing that for about the last year, but before that, for about 4 years, I was working at a web hosting company doing sort of server admin and tech support work. And in the world of web hosting, if any of you all have been there, you know that DDoS can happen on a regular occurrence, and you kind of have to learn to deal with it on the fly, especially for sites who haven't had protection in place in the first place. And so I'll preface this all by saying I'm no InfoSec security expert, but this is all sort of based on my experience that I've had in the web hosting sphere, seeing some DDoS attacks happen in real life. So we'll have a section for Q&A at the end. Again, I'm not an expert, so if I don't know, I'll be sure to tell you, but I'm glad to answer whatever questions I can. Today we'll just get a brief overview of what a DDoS attack is. We'll look at botnets and malware and how they can be used to create a DDoS attack. We'll look at the threat landscape for IoT devices and the OSI model, so where attacks tend to happen within that model. And then we'll also look at mitigation and prevention techniques. And last, we'll look at what's happening around the world in terms of legislation to help prevent DDoS as a whole. And then at the end, like I said, there will be a Q&A. But I'm going to go ahead and dive in. I have a lot of content to get through. Hopefully I don't speed through it, because this is my first time presenting. So be kind. So first of all, what is a DDoS? DDoS stands for Distributed Denial of Service. So denial of service meaning the intention is to take your website offline for real users who actually want to access your website. And then distributed meaning it's an attack from multiple vectors, so it's not just one user, one IP address, one user agent for you to easily block with firewall rules. It's something that's a lot more complicated. It's coming from multiple vectors across potentially the entire world, lots of different user agents, and potentially different behavior. And so that makes DDoS attacks pretty scary, especially when you see a visualization of it like this. This is a tool called IP Viking from Norse that actually tracks real DDoS-style traffic around the world. It is kind of a memory stuck on your computer, so just be aware before you go to that website. But this is a visualization where you can see there's attacks coming from all these different vectors around the world targeting one particular site in the US. And you can really see the distributed nature of it in this sort of a visualization. So it becomes really difficult to mitigate if you don't have any sort of protection or mitigation in place already to help prevent this sort of thing from happening. So my experience in the web hosting sphere, we had a lot of people who would get DDoSed, and we'd have to sort of write caching rules and Nginx rules on the fly to try to catch specific bad subnets or pages that were being hit especially hard to sort of soak the attack in the middle of it. But it becomes a lot easier if you already have a firewall or some sort of system sitting in front of your server that can catch that attack before it even gets sent back to the server that's hosting your content. And so we'll talk more about what those prevention and mitigation strategies look like later on. Here's some examples of some of the biggest DDoS attacks throughout history. One of them, I'm sure a lot of people in this room noticed last year, was that GitHub was attacked in 2018, and this attack was specifically against the memcache servers for GitHub. These servers were open, and so any person was able to query the key value store that they have that's like a caching layer in front of their database. And so attackers were able to utilize that to send a small request that then has a really big payload and makes their servers work really hard to send that big of content back to them, and then sent millions of requests at a time to overwhelm those servers. So that was one of the biggest DDoS attacks ever recorded at 1.3 terabytes per second. Also, one that's pretty famous is called the Mirai botnet. This is a botnet that was created by a few Minecraft users back in about 2016. At one point, they even made the source code for it open source so that anyone could use it to create a botnet, which then further made the problem worse. And at its heyday, the Mirai botnet was sending about 1.1 terabytes per second of traffic. There was also an attack in 2016 on Dyn DNS. I like to refer to it as the day the internet died, because I was working in web hosting at the time, doing technical support, working with clients. And that one was a really tough one to explain to people that, no, the server where your content is hosted is fully up and operational and just fine, but the backbones of the internet are what's down. So you may be trying to get to your site and you just can't. So this one was specifically an attack on the internet backbone servers where they found an open port and sent a flood of UDP traffic to that port in order to take down basically a lot of the internet along the entire east coast of the United States. In 2014, PopVote in Hong Kong, they experienced an attack on their DNS resolver servers. So these servers received a lot of traffic, and even though, again, their origin server where their content was hosted stayed online the whole time, nobody could get to their site because the DNS servers that basically told people is the phone book of the internet, mydomain.com lives at this IP address, nobody could get to that because the phone book that told them where it was down. So you can see there's a lot of different examples of different types of DDoS attacks. And the frustrating thing is that those attacks aren't getting any smaller or less frequent as time goes on. So it used to be back in, I don't know, early 2000s, late 90s, where you could get a group of your friends together and all send a request to the website at the same time and take it down that way. Obviously, website stability has grown quite a bit, but with it, so have DDoS attack techniques and everything. So you can see that the bandwidth in particular has really skyrocketed in the last couple of years, peaking last year at about 1.7 terabytes per second. So seeing an attack in this size and these sorts of natures makes you really think about disaster recovery and prevention. Would your website, would your system or application be able to withstand that amount of traffic if a DDoS attack were to be targeted or targeting your website? So it also makes you wonder, who in their right mind would DDoS a website? Why would someone go out and do that to a nice site just sitting on the internet, right? Well, there can be a lot of different motives for DDoS. So they may want to ransom. That's on the rise, where attackers will send a sort of flood of traffic to your website in an effort to take it down, and will continue to send it until you pay them a certain sum of money. It could be you have a upset client or disgruntled employee who decides to target your business for those reasons. They may simply want to disarm your business, just they don't like your message. It may be political hacktivism, for example. Or it could even just be that they want your secure data. DDoS attacks can be used as a distraction for brute force and other sort of attacks that seek to gain access to your user data. But the reality is, if anyone has the motive and the money, with the rise of DDoS for hire services, that means anyone could be a victim of a DDoS attack. Anyone with the motive and the means to access a DDoS for hire service could send this sort of malicious traffic to your website. So that also makes you wonder, what does a DDoS cost? If it could happen to anyone at any time, what would I be looking at in terms of mitigating and taking care of that DDoS problem? Well, for an enterprise, the average cost of a DDoS is about $2 million. And for a small or medium-sized business, it's around $120,000. Another study said that most DDoS attacks take about 6 to 24 hours on average, and they are about $40,000 per hour in terms of costs to mitigate it. So this is not even taking into account just the amount of extra bandwidth that you're likely paying for from your infrastructure provider, or the cost to spin up new servers in case your server is crashed and can't do anything. But beyond that, there's other consequences as well. So if your servers, for example, host HIPAA data or social security numbers or other personally identifiable information, if that data is breached, as it often is in these sorts of attacks, then you could be facing lawsuits, you could be facing brand reputation loss, and if it's something like a storefront that goes down, you're losing sales during that time as well. And then there's the frazzled IT staff that will be dealing with trying to bring up new servers and mitigate that traffic in real time, which is a nightmare in and of itself. So those costs can really start to skyrocket, especially when you talk about things that are really hard to put a price tag on, like your brand reputation. That sort of trust can be really hard to win back from your users. So when we're talking about a DDoS, a lot of times, especially these days, we're talking about a distributed denial of service attack, meaning it's coming from vectors all around the world. How do attackers make that happen? Well, it's not like they're going and just buying server space in some like server all around the world. They're not actually like purchasing these servers and owning them and sending traffic through them. They're using malware to infiltrate people's actual devices and then using those to send traffic to your website. So they do this in what's called a botnet. Botnet meaning it's an abbreviation of robot and network. But basically these things are devices that have been hacked and have malware installed on them, all network together to send traffic based on an attacker's directions. So there's three main components of a botnet. You have your maniacal bot herder at the end of the chain, and they're the ones sending the directions and scanning and trying to find an opportunity to install malware on different devices. So malware is malicious software. Usually it'll include some sort of IRC or chat relay program that the attacker can use to send messages to your device. And then there's the devices themselves, which then turn into zombies to perform the bot herder's will and send traffic to whatever website they may deem to be attacked. So the tricky part about your IoT devices and the things and the malware that attackers may install on them is that you would have very little chance of catching that it's actually sending this malicious traffic. Unless you're doing like live TCP dumps on like your iPhone or your router, you're usually not going to see that outgoing traffic to those websites. And so it can be really hard to detect if your device is actually being used to bring harm to websites around the world. So practicing basic security, like just rotating your passwords, making sure your devices are locked down with a passcode and that it doesn't have all ports open to the internet, just basic security can help keep those things secure, especially if you're rotating those passwords and passphrases pretty frequently. And throughout history, there have been a lot of botnets around the world. We talked briefly about Mirai. This is a botnet that gained a list of IP addresses through not so legal ways and then port scanned against all of them. And once it found open ports, it sent brute force attacks for common usernames and passwords against those ports to see if it could gain access and install its malware, which it did a lot. We saw a lot of attacks from these Mirai-style botnets, especially in the 2016-2017 years. Some botnets are not necessarily for DDoS. Some can be for sending spam email, for example. So Zero Access and Grum, these are both botnets that were used to send spam email around the world. Grum, thankfully, is shut down now, but at one point it was sending over 18% of all spam email around the entire world, which is pretty incredible, if you ask me. And then the Hajime botnet is really similar to Mirai, except it targeted specific kinds of IoT devices like routers, DVR, and CCTV systems, and did a similar sort of thing where it found open ports and brute forced regular login credentials. So you can see how just basic security would help prevent against a lot of these different botnet attacks. And that brings me to the IoT threat landscape, because as you all know, IoT, the Internet of Things, has grown exponentially in the last few years. So every day you learn of a new internet-connected device. I just heard of an internet-connected toothbrush, which blew me away. Like, who needs an internet-connected toothbrush? But apparently people out there need internet-connected toothbrushes. But there's things like gaming systems, your iPhone, your iPad, your router, your smart thermostat, your smart doorbell, your baby monitor. They have an IoT device where you can live video stream with your dog and dispense a treat to him. So just really cool devices out there, except a lot of times there's just not enough regulation in the industry to tell the creators of these devices that they have to have standards for internet security when they're creating these devices. So a lot of times you'll see things like default usernames and passwords that come on devices, with the idea that surely it will be easier for users to set up their device if I have the same username and password on them when they come. Well, most users don't ever think to change the default username and password. They don't think to change the network name or password on their router. They don't think to install security or firmware updates on their smart thermostat. And so there's a lot of things that you could be doing just to check the basic security protocols of your devices. Right now out there, there's a really common thing called universal plug-and-play. So you may be familiar with smart doorbell systems, for example, where they're constantly recording whenever there's motion in front of your door. Well, it has to store that data somewhere, and if it doesn't, then it's streaming it to a device live. So cloud storage can obviously get very expensive, especially if you're dealing with video or HD video. So in lieu of paying for cloud storage, a lot of users will simply want to stream it live to their device. Well, that's the universal plug-and-play connection, is that it allows your device from whatever network you may be on to connect to your Internet of Things device at home, like your smart doorbell. Well, your smart doorbell arranges this with your router by saying, hey, any traffic you receive on this port, direct it straight to me, not setting any IP restrictions. And so anyone on the internet that discovers that port could then have access to your Ring doorbell. It gets scarier when devices that are like watching your children while they sleep are open to the internet, home security devices. Those things are the things that keep me up at night, just like worrying about things. So there's a lot of risk involved in IoT that people don't think of because they're just delighted by the fact that they can do these sorts of things with the internet. But again, just practicing basic security, like going in and checking to see, am I able to secure it with a password? What are my security settings? Calling OnStar to see, how do you verify that I'm really me if I call you and say, turn off my car while it's driving? You know, these sorts of things, just basic security checks, can help keep you safe from not only botnets and malware, but from other security breaches as well. So your own personal data, keeping it safe. I have two hard and fast rules when it comes to Internet of Things. So rule number one, every internet-connected device is a potential entry point for malware. Every single time you buy an internet-connected device, you should be thinking about this, and you should be thinking about the security settings of those devices. And rule number two, if you can install malware on it, an attacker can harness that to attack you or others. So you being your own personal data and using that to attack you or ransom information, and then others being, they could use it to attack others with a botnet and malware. So now that we've gotten a little bit of a background on DDoS attacks and how they happen, how they're structured, let's examine the OSI model and take a look at where these sorts of attacks can happen. I like to think of the OSI model as the 7 layers of a delicious internet cake. You've got several different layers ranging from hardware all the way to the layer where a user actually interacts with your application or your website. And most commonly, I'll say on this slide, is those attacks will usually happen on layers 3 and 4 and 7. So just a quick overview of the OSI model. Layer 1 is your physical layer where actual cables are connecting to actual ports. Think like 90s LAN parties. So these are the physical connection between different internet ports. At layer 2, you have your data link layer. So this is the connection between devices that are on the same network. For example, my iPhone and my router at home are on the same network, and so data that's transferred between them is transferred in frames. So it's broken apart on the source device and then reassembled on the destination device. And this may sound really familiar to a concept we all know as packets, which happen at the network layer with IP and ICMP ping. Those are the sorts of protocols that are used at this layer. So this layer is responsible for disassembling and reassembling those packets on devices that are on different networks. So when my iPhone requests google.com, my iPhone's not on the same network as Google, and so it's communicating in packets between those two servers. Layer 4 is the transport layer. So this layer is responsible for end-to-end communication and flow control. So if a fast layer or a fast network is trying to talk to a slow network, its flow control role is basically to make sure that that fast network doesn't overwhelm the slow network with too many packets per second. And it's also responsible for reporting back errors if packets were lost or it had issues communicating with different backbones in the internet and trying to send data back and forth. So this is where the TCP handshake and UDP packets would be sent. And then 5 is the session layer. This is where APIs and sockets tend to communicate. This is responsible for keeping a session open for as long as you're communicating with a website, for example. So from when you put an item, or when you first access a website, to when you put an item in your cart, to when you check out, and then leave the website, that's a whole user session on a website. Session layer is responsible for opening and then closing that session when it's done. And layer 6 is the presentation layer. I like to think of this layer as all about translation. So if you're using anything to encrypt or otherwise translate data on your website, then this layer is responsible for translating it back into something that your application can actually understand. So SSL, SSH, SFTP, all of those things that have secure in front usually mean they have a layer of encryption that needs to be translated at the presentation layer. And then finally, layer 7, this is where we see a lot of the botnets and DDoS attacks, is the application layer. This is the layer where the user actually interacts with your application. They're clicking things, they're requesting new pages. So this is where your protocols for DNS, HTTP, and a lot of the most common protocols are used. So on these different layers, layer 3 tend to be, it did escalate quickly. Layer 3 tends to be things like IP spoofing, ICMP, ping floods, that sort of thing. Layer 4 is where you'll see TCP and UDP and SYN floods. So, for example, the Dyn DNS attack, that was a UDP flood on an open port, and so that was a layer 4 attack. And then layer 7 is where you tend to see things like HTTP floods, DNS amplification attacks. So most commonly these days we're seeing a really big rise in layer 7 attacks. Even the attack on GitHub that was on the Memcache servers, those were on layer 7 as well. So now that I've thoroughly scared you with all of the different things about DDoS, let's talk mitigation. First and foremost, I'll preface everything by saying the very best thing you can do in terms of mitigation is to protect against DDoS before it happens. And this is because of a concept called your origin server. So, your origin server is the content, or is the server that hosts the content for your actual website. This server is really, really important, and you should always, always want to protect that server. So if you have a server sitting out there and you're just pointing mydomain.com straight via A record or CNAME record to your server where your content is hosted, here's what happens. Someone who wants to target your website looks up your DNS records, and they see mydomain.com points to my IP address where your origin server is hosted. They send malicious traffic to it. Your server catches on fire, perhaps literally. But you think, oh no, I'm under attack. I should put a WAF or some sort of firewall there to protect against that traffic. But your attacker already knows the origin IP of your server, and therefore they can send direct traffic to that server still, even though you've put a firewall in front of it. So that means in order to actually be protected, you then either have to reassign a new IP address, which, spoiler alert, a lot of infrastructure providers will not do if you are under DDoS attack. And if you can't assign a new IP address, it could mean that you have to migrate to an entirely different server, which becomes an even bigger problem if you can't even access your origin server to begin with, because how are you going to copy that content? So it's something that a lot of websites don't think about until it's too late. Whereas if you've got a layer of protection there already, you've got your firewall up, your attacker queries your DNS records and they see that your domain.com is pointed to IP of the firewall.com. And so they may send malicious traffic to that, or they may realize, oh, this is an IP address of a firewall and not send the attack in the first place. But if they do send the attack, the web application firewall, or whatever you're using to protect your site against this sort of traffic, is the one that receives that traffic in the first place. And they have rules that say don't pass malicious traffic through to the origin server, which means your origin server, where your site is actually hosted, has been online the whole time, while your web application firewall is doing the hard work to actually deflect the bad traffic. So it becomes a much simpler situation if you have a layer of defense there in the first place. So when we're talking about different types of DDoS protection services, there's web application firewall with a managed WAF service. I will say not every WAF is a WAF that's intended for DDoS mitigation. Most will say they'll have like a OWASP top 10 rule set to help protect against like cross-site scripting and things like that. But if it actually does have DDoS mitigation services, then they'll have extra things like, JavaScript challenges for bots, allow deny rule sets so that you can block like country of origin, user agents, and IP ranges. And then most managed WAF services that actually offer DDoS protection will also offer some sort of CDN or caching service. So CDN meaning content delivery network, and that basically means your content that's hosted on your origin server is then reflected across a network of servers worldwide. It could be 100, it could be 2,000 servers worldwide. And that offers a lot of benefits in terms of just serving your content to a worldwide audience, so they can get it faster without much latency. But it also means that if an attacker targets one of the nodes of that CDN, it's only taking down one of the nodes. So traffic can easily be rerouted to the other servers around it and still keep your origin server up and everything. The other benefit of this is that even if some sort of rules and detection fail, the benefit of a really wide network like this is that worst case scenario, they could just soak the traffic. They could absorb that level of traffic and still come out on the other side okay. So these sorts of services can be really beneficial when it comes to dealing with DDoS. The other thing that is an option potentially is in-server protection. And these tend to be more in-house solutions that you may have tailored yourself to see, to say, I know if an attacker, or if someone hits my login page this many times and performs this action, that's a bad behavior. And so after X amount of bad behavior, we'll block that IP address automatically in IP tables. Or it may have a JavaScript challenge. Actually having like a software that's available for resale for in-server protection like this is pretty rare, but there are some services out there that will allow you to do this. So this sort of system can actually help you if you're already under attack and you can still access your server to install this software. And in this case, it's not actually obfuscating your origin IP, but it's actually sitting like a load balancer in front of the web server, like Apache or Nginx on your server, and only allowing through known good traffic. So those are some options as well. But while we're talking about protection, there are some other things you can do to reduce risk too. So there is also distributing your domain across multiple subdomains. So you could have blog.mydomain.com on one server, shop.mydomain.com on another, and that way if shop.mydomain.com is targeted, the other server is up and just fine and continues to serve your customers. You can also distribute your TLDs, your top-level domains. So you could have your main site, mydomain.com, on one DNS host, and mydomain.net on another, and mydomain.org on yet another. And this way, if the DNS resolver servers for one host go down, you can fire up the other one and still have your site continuously serving traffic through it all. So there are some things you can do to help reduce the risk overall. And let's see. Do I still have time? I think I still have time. Okay. So last, let's talk prevention. So what's being done around the world today to limit the scope of DDoS and trying to rein it in so that people don't DDoS your site in the first place. Well, there has been some legislation that's been passed, but due to the distributed nature of DDoS attacks, it usually is more effective to have a cross-country partnership to focus on bringing down these sort of perpetrators. So a lot of the action that's happened in the last few years has been through cross-country organization to bring down the sorts of perpetrators. So first legislation, in the US, they passed the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act all the way back in 1984. And because it was 1984, there wasn't DDoS specifically named in the rule, but the action of a DDoS, the behavior of a DDoS, does fall into the abuse category. So that means that people who are found guilty of DDoSing sites can be charged with prison time. And in the UK, they have this is a weirdly named one, Police and Justice Act, that specifically calls out DDoS as an action that is punishable by up to 10 years in prison. So there are some laws that have been passed specifically to DDoS, but like I said, the organization between nations has been really key in the last few years. So legally, looking at some of the timelines, from about 2015 to now, there's been some good action. Back in 2015, the hacktivist group Anonymous petitioned the White House to recognize DDoS as a legal form of free speech, similar to a sit-in. Unsurprisingly, that was not something that they accepted. So yes, DDoS is still illegal and you should not do it. In 2016, Europol took down a website called DD4BC, or DDoS for Bitcoin, another DDoS for hire service, and that was a cross-nation partnership as well. In 2017, the FBI began asking victims of DDoS to come forward and provide details about the DDoS attack that they were under, so that they can begin going after those perpetrators. And that call is still open, so if you have been a victim of DDoS, the FBI wants to talk to you. In a good way, I promise. In 2018, this is a really big one. The US, the UK, and the Netherlands got together, and they took down webstressor.org. Not only did they take it down, they repossessed the site, and that means they got all of the data in the database, including those who paid for DDoS for hire services. So then in 2018, they began going after the people who paid for DDoS for hire services and taking them to court. So we're seeing some action in that finally now in 2019. And then in 2018 as well, the creators of the Mirai botnet, those 3 Minecraft users, they finally went to court for their actions, and they pled that they should serve community service by helping the FBI identify other botnets and take down cyber criminals. And so they've already been helping the FBI a lot, even in the Memcached attack on GitHub, to help bring justice to those people whose sites have been targeted. And then earlier in 2015, the FBI took down 15 DDoS for hire booter sites that had kind of been spun up in the time that webstressor.org has been down. So you can see there's been a lot of action that's happened in the last few years, and it may be slow and few and far between, but these actions are kind of setting a precedent so that these attackers realize that their actions are not completely hidden. They can be prosecuted for DDoS. So, that was a whirlwind. But I wanted to make sure that we left some time at the end for a Q&A. Does anyone have any questions for me about DDoS? Yeah?
What are your opinions on using a service like Cloudflare?
So the question was, what are my opinions about using a service like Cloudflare? Personally, I am a Cloudflare fangirl. I love Cloudflare because they're a web application firewall service that specifically protects against DDoS. Their network is 10 times larger than the largest DDoS ever recorded. So, like I said, if their rules for some reason don't work, they can soak the attack and your site can still be fine. And this is not something everyone does. They don't charge overages for the extra bandwidth that you incur from a DDoS attack. So that's really great. So I personally love Cloudflare. There are a lot of other services out there for it as well. There's like Akamai, Encapsula, Security Cloud Proxy that specifically name DDoS mitigation as a service that they offer. Anyone else? Questions? Yeah?
How effective are, in your opinion, web application firewalls for stopping the so HTTP attacks?
So the question was how effective are web application firewalls for detecting and mitigating DDoS attacks on layer 7 specifically, like HTTP floods. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're not. It really depends on the type of website. So for example, I used to work at a WordPress web hosting company, and WordPress has some commonalities in all of the sites. They use wp-login.php for their login page, and it makes it really easy to identify bad behavior if a bot continuously hits that page. And so it makes it really easy for a web application firewall to write a rule that identifies bad behavior on that page. But if your site is a little more obscure, you're not using pages that are commonly named things that might be targeted, it can be harder for them to identify traffic that might be malicious, but they will still block against like cross-site scripting and things that would otherwise be, in the OWASP top 10. So my answer is it depends. That's why I really recommend one that will offer caching and CDN as well, so that worst case scenario, you still have a network that can soak the attack and can absorb all of the traffic. Does that make sense? Cool. Yeah?
So, say you're hit with a DDoS attack, it's actively running now. What do you recommend as courses of action, both from a technical side and from a customer management side?
Okay, so the question was, you're currently under DDoS attack right now, your server's on fire. What actions do you think someone could take to mitigate it? What was it, server side and?
Both from a technical standpoint to fight the attack, and also how to manage user expectations and customer expectations.
Oh, that's a good question. So how to manage user expectations and how to handle it from a technical side. Well, first from the technical side, while you can still access your server, if at all possible, start migrating your content to a different server immediately, whether you have that server online or not. And get signed up for Cloudflare or another WAF service that specifically absorbs and accepts DDoS-style traffic. So that you can then, once you've migrated it to the new server, you can change your DNS records with Cloudflare to point to that new server. That means your new server is now obfuscated, the attacker can't find it easily. And so that's the first thing to do. And then if for some reason the attacker still finds out the origin IP, you might have to get multiple layers of WAFs going. I've seen it where people have had to put in Cloudflare and then proxy through Security Cloud Proxy and then to their origin server, and that seemed to obfuscate it enough that the attackers couldn't target it anymore. So from the technical side, those sorts of things can help. Also, putting in page caching rules can help you soak it on your origin server as well. So if there's anything you can do that can be persistent caching across all users, put in those caching rules, cache it for as long as you possibly can, and then put in some IP blocks for any commonalities you may see, like IP ranges or common user agents or countries that the attack might be coming from, to sort of help deflect it in your own server. So from the technical side, that's what I'd say. In terms of managing expectations for users, that's a tough one. Let's see, what would I say? It's tough because you're dealing with the loss of potential trust in your customers. I think it's important to acknowledge when there is an issue happening, because I think stalling and trying to get around it will only lead to more customer frustration and loss of trust. So being upfront and saying, we're experiencing a disruption in our service right now, we are working to identify and mitigate the issue, and we'll update you as soon as possible, will help make sure that the customers are aware of the issue. I also think giving specific time intervals, whether you have an update or not, to say our next update will be in 2 hours, for example, to say we've identified the issue now, or here's the status, will continue to keep them engaged and trust that you are continuously working on the issue. You haven't forgotten about them. They are your utmost priority. Does that help? Cool. Yeah?
I'm also curious about how exactly the firewalls identify attacks or malicious scripts, because you did mention that if there are a lot of requests to a certain page, that might be a point, but what other ways to identify malicious scripts or attacks
Yeah. So
from a firewall?
Yeah, so the question was, how do web application firewalls identify malicious traffic beyond just identifying requests to a specific page that might be vulnerable? Unfortunately, a lot of it is a guessing game, but They do have rule sets. The OWASP top 10 rule set is a big one. And that blocks against some of the top security threats around the globe. In terms of botnet and other sort of traffic that might be really weighing down your server, unfortunately, it could be coming from any direction, and it could be coming across a vector of different pages. But if they see an overwhelming amount of traffic to a web page that's not expected, they may flag that as potential abuse. So they could say volume of requests or bandwidth of requests might be a flag. Unfortunately, a lot of times you don't know. So when I was working in web hosting, a lot of times I'd see an overwhelming amount of traffic to a web page, and I'd think, oh no, that might be a DDoS attack. But then I'd reach out to the customer and I'd say, I'm seeing a concerning amount of traffic on this page. Is this expected? So maybe flagging it like warning level, right? And if the customer says, oh no, I'm not expecting that amount of traffic, then, we may put some rules in place to block it, or put in extra caching on that page, or recommend they get an extra layer of WAF in place. But if they are expecting it, maybe they're having a flash sale, or maybe they are expecting like a lot of traffic because they're having some sort of an event. That could be the case too. And so for us, it always came down to checking with the customer first to see, is this something that you expect? Because we don't want to take down something for your website that may be really important, especially if you're having a sort of event. We don't want to take down the event or take down the party, Go ahead.
Does that also waste maybe valuable time in communicating with the client? Maybe in the time that the communication goes on.
Yes.
Goes on fire.
Yes, it does. So the question was, does that waste valuable time having to communicate with the client? Yes, especially if you have to communicate via email or you don't have a direct line to the client. So it's tough being in the web hosting sphere, because a lot of times your customers won't have thought, if I'm expecting a lot of traffic, maybe I should talk to my web hosting provider and see about bulking up my server, or letting them know just I'm expecting a lot of traffic. So they may be really busy hosting their event and be really hard to get a hold of. Meanwhile, their server is burning down. And so they won't reach out to you until there's already a problem. So if a customer comes to you with a problem, then it becomes a lot easier, right? Because we know there's a problem already. But if not, then it does waste valuable time trying to talk to the customer first and see what's going on. So some companies do just have automatic bans at certain places. But that kind of leads to customer frustration if they don't know where those limits are and they are having some sort of an event. So it can be a tricky one to navigate for sure.
Are you aware, besides so I deal with chat log scanning and dynamic.
Yeah, so the question was, are you aware of something that performs better at scale than fail to ban for blocking IPs and malicious traffic and log scanning and sorts of things? So some of the in-server protection services, I know of one called Hive Shield that will do the sort of JavaScript challenging. It will block all bots except for known good scanners. And that one can be really good for mitigating and blocking bad traffic. A lot of people make in-house ones for, like the WordPress shop I was working at. They wrote their own application with IPsec to basically identify bad behaviors, like 5 hits to the login page and that's one warning, 5 sets of those and then you get blocked. Exactly. And like IP tables. Fail to ban is a good one. It's automatic, but again, it can cause frustration sometimes if you don't realize that the behavior that you're exhibiting.
Well, it's more like the logs are like.
Yeah, if they get massive, yeah.
It gets massive and it's like really hard for it to, like it'll ban, but it'll ban like 3 minutes later and your site's already down, for example.
Yeah, yeah. So he was saying that because the logs get so big, it'll ban it, but not in enough time. Too late for it to really have an impact. So it can be a really tricky one to navigate. I think we are at time, so I'll let you guys go. I love nerding out about this stuff, so you can come and talk to me now, or I'll be in the speaker's corner for about an hour after this if you want to come talk about DDoS with me. Thank you, everyone.